February 15th, 1999. A luxurious villa perched on the golden shores of Maui, Hawaii. The perfect backdrop for a honeymoon straight out of a fairy tale. But what awaited inside was anything but a dream. When the housekeeper unlocked the door that morning, she stumbled upon a scene she would never forget. Diane Gray, a radiant bride who had married the love of her life just days before, was lying lifeless on the marble floor. Blood streaked her pale skin, and the jagged remains of a champagne bottle told a story of violence too horrific to comprehend. Her husband, Jeff Gray, was slumped in the living room, dazed, disheveled, and reeking of alcohol. His words were incoherent, his memory conveniently blank, but the blood on his clothes, the evidence scattered around the villa, and the bruises that told a story of suffering made one thing chillingly clear. This was no accident. How did a week of love and laughter spiral into a night of unspeakable brutality? What darkness lurked behind the picture-perfect smiles of the newlyweds? This is the story of Diane and Jeff Gray, a couple whose love story ended in bloodshed, and the shocking events that turned a romantic paradise into the stage for a murder that still haunts to this day. Stay with us as we uncover the twisted path that led to this tragic finale. Diane Gray was the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into. At 28, she had a warmth and charisma that drew people in, a beloved elementary school teacher whose passion for nurturing young minds made her adored by colleagues and students alike. Diane's life was simple but fulfilling, filled with moments of joy spent with close friends, family, and her love for painting, a hobby she'll pursue more seriously one day. Jeff Gray, on the other hand, lived in a world of ambition and high stakes. At 31, he had built a thriving real estate business from the ground up. His sharp suits, confident demeanor, and natural charm were hard to ignore. To those who met him, Jeff was the definition of success, a man who knew what he wanted and stopped at nothing to get it. Their worlds collided on a crisp evening in March 1996 at a charity gala in downtown Chicago. Diane, attending at the request of a friend, found herself mingling among a crowd far removed from her usual circle. Jeff, ever the networker, noticed her almost immediately. She stood out, not for her glittering dress or bold personality, but for her quiet grace, her genuine smile that seemed untouched by the pretenses of the evening. It didn't take long for Jeff to approach her, and their conversation flowed effortlessly. Jeff was captivated by Diane's kindness and sincerity, and Diane was drawn to his confidence and charm. By the end of the night, they had exchanged numbers, and Jeff made it clear he was determined to see her again. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Jeff showered Diane with grand romantic gestures, lavish dinners at rooftop restaurants, surprise bouquets delivered to her classroom, and weekend getaways to places she'd only dreamed of visiting. Diane was swept off her feet, convinced she'd found the man of her dreams. But even in those blissful moments, there were hints of something darker beneath Jeff's polished exterior. He would get agitated when Diane mentioned spending time with male friends, or if she didn't answer his calls immediately. At first, it seemed like endearing protectiveness, a sign of how much he cared. But as time went on, his possessiveness became harder to ignore. Once, during a dinner with friends, Jeff's demeanor shifted when Diane laughed at a joke made by another man. His jaw tightened, his smile faltered, and he barely spoke for the rest of the evening. Later that night, he accused Diane of being too friendly, leaving her stunned and confused. She brushed it off, telling herself it was just a misunderstanding, a minor flaw in an otherwise perfect man. Diane's friends noticed the subtle changes in her. The once vibrant, carefree woman seemed more cautious, as if she were walking on eggshells to avoid upsetting Jeff. But when they voiced their concerns, Diane would dismiss them with a reassuring smile. Jeff loved her, she'd say, and relationships always came with challenges. Despite the small cracks in their relationship, the good moments outweighed the bad, or so Diane believed. When Jeff proposed just a year later, in front of the sparkling Eiffel Tower, Diane said yes without hesitation. It felt like the culmination of every romantic dream she'd ever had. But as the months leading to their wedding unfolded, those cracks widened, revealing the foundation of their whirlwind romance was far less stable than it seemed. What Diane mistook for love and devotion was something far more dangerous, a need for control, cloaked in the guise of affection. And yet, Blinded by the promise of a future together, Diane convinced herself that everything would be fine. She couldn't have known then that the man who made her feel so adored would also become the source of her darkest nightmare. February 6, 1999. The skies over Chicago were gray, but inside the historic St. James Cathedral, the air buzzed with excitement. Guests dressed in their finest filled the grand hall, adorned with white roses and golden accents, a vision of elegance orchestrated down to the smallest detail. It was the wedding of Diane and Jeff Gray, a union that seemed to embody love, success, and perfection. Diane walked down the aisle in a stunning lace gown, her face radiant with a mix of joy and nervous energy. Jeff, standing tall in a tailored black tuxedo, beamed at her from the altar. To the hundreds of friends and family gathered, they looked like the perfect couple, a fairy tale romance brought to life. The ceremony was breathtaking, the kind that left guests marveling at the attention to detail. Every moment felt meticulously planned, from the heartfelt vows to the enchanting string quartet playing softly in the background. It was a day most would remember as a celebration of love and commitment. But beneath the grandeur, a few close to Diane noticed the cracks. Her smiles seemed forced at times, her laughter faintly strained. When she thought no one was looking, she appeared distracted, her gaze distant. Her best friend, Emma, had tried to broach the subject days earlier, asking if Diane was truly happy. Diane had brushed it off with her usual optimism, insisting it was just pre-wedding nerves. What Diane didn't share was how much control Jeff had exerted over every detail of the wedding. From the flowers to the seating arrangements, even down to the choice of her wedding dress, Jeff had insisted on making the final decisions. He framed it as wanting everything to be perfect for her, but his tone left little room for argument. The stress had mounted in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Diane found herself constantly compromising, agreeing to things she didn't want just to keep the peace. Jeff's frustration would flare over minor inconveniences, his sharp words cutting through her attempts to smooth things over. "It's our wedding, Diane," he had said more than once. "Don't you want it to be flawless?" To Diane, it was easier to let him take the reins, convincing herself it was a sign of how much he cared. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't how it was supposed to be. As they exchanged vows in front of their loved ones, Diane clung to the hope that this marked a new beginning. She wanted to believe that the tensions of wedding planning would fade, that their marriage would bring out the best in both of them. The reception that followed was a dazzling affair, filled with champagne toasts, laughter, and heartfelt speeches. Jeff charmed everyone with his wit and warmth, and Diane played the perfect bride, her reserved demeanor interpreted as graceful poise. Together, they seemed unstoppable, a power couple destined for greatness. But those closest to Diane couldn't ignore the flickers of unease they saw in her eyes. And as the night wore on, Emma couldn't shake the nagging thought, Diane wasn't herself. Diane and Jeff left the reception to a flurry of cheers and sparklers, heading off to their dream honeymoon in Hawaii. To everyone watching, it was the beginning of their happily ever after. But for Diane, it was the start of something she couldn't yet fully comprehend, a journey that would take her far from the fairy tale she had imagined. The perfection of their wedding day was a mirage, concealing the growing shadows that would soon consume their lives. February 8, 1999. Diane and Jeff Gray stepped out of their private car onto the lush grounds of the Halakai Resort, a secluded paradise tucked away on the shores of Maui, Hawaii. The air was warm, scented with tropical flowers, and the sound of waves crashing against the beach was like a promise of serenity. Diane smiled, taking in the breathtaking view of turquoise waters and endless skies. It was everything she had imagined their honeymoon would be. The resort staff greeted them with leis and champagne, ushering them to their private villa, a haven of luxury, with sprawling marble floors, a canopy bed draped in soft white linens, and a balcony that overlooked the vast Pacific. It was a place designed for romance, and Diane felt a flicker of hope that this trip would be the fresh start they needed. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect couple, basking in the glow of newlywed bliss. They strolled hand in hand along the beach, shared intimate dinners under the stars, and laughed together during a sunset cruise organized by the resort. Guests at the resort couldn't help but admire them, a striking pair who looked like they had stepped out of a postcard. But those moments of harmony masked a tension that was harder to see. The resort staff began to notice the subtle cracks. Diane's demeanor, though outwardly cheerful, seemed guarded at times. Her laughter was soft but fleeting, and her body language betrayed a quiet unease. Jeff's mood was unpredictable. One moment he was doting, the next he was curt, his tone sharp over small matters like a misplaced towel or an undercooked meal. One evening, a server at the resort restaurant witnessed an uncomfortable exchange. Diane, trying to lighten the mood, had joked about Jeff's sunburn from their afternoon at the beach. Jeff's smile froze, and though he chuckled along with her, his words carried an edge when he replied, "Maybe you should pay more attention to me instead of the other guests." Diane quickly changed the subject, her face flushing as she looked down at her plate. Housekeeping staff reported hearing raised voices from the villa on more than one occasion. Though the arguments were muffled, the tone was unmistakable. Jeff's voice rising, forceful and angry, while Diane's replies came in soft, measured tones, as though she were trying to calm him. Despite these moments, Diane carried on, trying to smooth over the rough edges. She told herself it was just the stress of travel and the adjustment to married life. She made excuses for Jeff's irritability, chalking it up to the pressures of running a business and planning a perfect honeymoon. And Jeff, in his own way, tried to make amends. After every disagreement, he would surprise Diane with a thoughtful gesture, an unexpected excursion, a gift from the resort boutique, or a quiet walk along the shore. These gestures reassured Diane, convincing her that things would get better, that the tension was only temporary. But the staff, who watched them from a distance, saw what Diane refused to acknowledge. They noticed the fleeting moments when Jeff's affectionate grip turned just a little too firm, the way Diane's smiles didn't always reach her eyes, the hesitations in her steps when Jeff led the way. The paradise of Hawaii stood in stark contrast to the growing unease between the couple. For Diane, the cracks in their honeymoon felt manageable, even normal. But what she didn't realize was that the storm brewing beneath the surface was far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The dream vacation was about to take a dark and irreversible turn. February 13th, 1999. The Halakai Resort was alive with the hum of conversation and the soft melodies of live Hawaiian music. The resort's bar, a popular evening retreat for honeymooners and vacationers, offered a serene view of the moonlit ocean. Diane and Jeff Gray sat at a corner table, sipping cocktails and watching the waves roll onto the shore. At first glance, they seemed like any other couple enjoying a romantic night out, but the cracks beneath their picture-perfect facade were growing harder to ignore. As Diane turned to the guest seated beside her, a silver-haired man with a kind smile who had just complimented the resort, she responded with her characteristic warmth. They exchanged pleasantries about the island's beauty, laughing lightly as he shared a story about his earlier snorkeling adventure. Jeff's eyes darkened. His jaw tightened, and the grip on his glass visibly firmed. Diane noticed his shifting mood almost immediately, her laughter tapering off as she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "It's nothing, Jeff," she said softly, her voice low and calming. He was just being friendly. But Jeff wasn't placated. His words, sharp and clipped, cut through the warm atmosphere. "You don't need to entertain every stranger who talks to you, Diane." Witnesses later described how the mood at their table soured in an instant. Diane leaned closer to Jeff, speaking quietly, her tone conciliatory, while Jeff's responses grew louder and more heated. His gestures became more exaggerated, pointing toward the man, leaning over the table and clenching his fists. The silver-haired man, sensing the shift, politely excused himself, but Jeff's anger didn't subside. Diane's attempts to redirect the conversation only seemed to fuel his agitation. "Why don't you just admit it?" Jeff snapped, his voice rising above the gentle murmur of the bar. "You've been paying more attention to everyone else than to me this entire trip." Diane's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as the attention of nearby guests turned their way. She cast an apologetic glance toward the staff and placed a hand on Jeff's, trying to calm him. "Jeff, please," she said softly, "let's not do this here." Witnesses later recounted how Diane seemed to shrink under the weight of Jeff's anger, her once bright demeanor dimmed. Resort staff, trained to de-escalate uncomfortable situations, approached the table with tact, offering to refresh their drinks or assist them with anything they needed. Jeff declined curtly, standing abruptly and pulling Diane by the arm. "We're leaving," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. CCTV footage later revealed the couple walking out of the bar, Jeff gripping Diane's arm tightly as she trailed behind him. Her movements were hesitant, her posture tense, as though she were trying to keep up without provoking him further. The atmosphere in the bar lightened as they exited, but for those who had witnessed the exchange, the discomfort lingered. "She looked scared," one guest later told investigators. "Not just embarrassed, actually scared." As the couple disappeared into the dimly lit path leading back to their villa, the waves continued to crash against the shore, indifferent to the storm brewing between Diane and Jeff. What had begun as a romantic evening had taken a dark turn, and for Diane, the night was far from over. The tension which had simmered beneath the surface for days was about to reach its breaking point. February 14th, 1999. Valentine's Day. A day meant for love and celebration, but for Diane Gray, it became the day her life would come to a tragic end. The tension from the previous evening at the bar lingered like a storm cloud over the couple's villa. Jeff's mood had not softened overnight. If anything, his simmering anger had only grown. Diane, desperate to salvage the remainder of their honeymoon, tried her best to create a peaceful atmosphere. She prepared breakfast, suggested a walk on the beach, and even offered to skip the resort's Valentine's dinner to spend time alone together. But Jeff was distant, his responses curt and dismissive. The day passed in strained silence, with only the occasional sharp comment from Jeff breaking the uneasy calm. By evening, the tension had become unbearable. In the villa, Diane finally confronted him. "Jeff, please," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "We can't keep going on like this. What's really bothering you?" Her words seemed to ignite something in him. "What's bothering me?" Jeff spat, his voice rising. "You act like you're the perfect wife, but you can't even show me the respect I deserve. You embarrassed me last night, Diane. Do you even care how that made me look?" Diane tried to respond to explain, but Jeff's words came faster, louder, drowning her out. He paced the room, his anger escalating with every step. Realizing the conversation was spiraling out of control, Diane stepped back, her voice calm but firm. "I think we both need to cool off, Jeff. Let's talk about this later." She retreated to the bathroom, closing and locking the door behind her. For a moment, she felt a flicker of safety, a barrier between her and Jeff's growing rage. But it didn't last. The sound of Jeff pounding on the door shattered the brief silence. "You don't walk away from me, Diane," he shouted, his voice filled with fury. The pounding grew louder, more insistent, until the sound of wood splintering filled the air. Jeff had forced the door open. What happened next was a blur of chaos and violence. Diane tried to shield herself, backing into the corner of the bathroom, but Jeff's anger had consumed him completely. His eyes landed on a champagne bottle resting on the counter, a romantic gesture from the resort that now became a weapon in his hands. He swung the bottle with terrifying force. The first blow sent Diane reeling, her head striking the tiles. Blood pooled quickly, staining the pristine floor. But Jeff didn't stop. His rage drove him to strike again and again, the bottle shattering after a final blow. Diane's attempts to protect herself faltered as the brutal assault continued. Her body crumpled against the cold floor, her strength slipping away with each strike. When the violence ended, the villa fell silent. Jeff stood over Diane's lifeless body, the shattered remnants of the champagne bottle still clutched in his trembling hand. The magnitude of what he had done seemed to sink in all at once. The villa, once a haven of luxury, now bore the marks of a horrific struggle. Blood spattered the walls, shards of glass glittered on the floor, and the bathroom door hung loosely from its broken hinges. Jeff staggered into the living room, collapsing onto the sofa. He muttered incoherently, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. The idyllic paradise of Maui had become the scene of an unspeakable tragedy. Diane Gray, a vibrant and kind-hearted woman, had come to Hawaii to celebrate the beginning of a new life. Instead, she had lost hers in a night of unimaginable horror. The morning would bring the discovery that would shock the resort, the authorities, and everyone who had ever known Diane and Jeff. But for now, the villa sat in haunting silence, bearing witness to the violent end of a love story that had turned into a nightmare. February 15th, 1999. The tranquil dawn broke over the Halakai resort, its serene beauty untouched by the horror that lay hidden in Villa 12. For the staff beginning their day, it was business as usual, guests to serve, rooms to tidy, and the promise of another postcard-perfect day in paradise. It wasn't until mid-morning that unease began to ripple through the resort. Diane and Jeff Gray had missed their scheduled breakfast delivery, an unusual occurrence for the couple who had been so punctual throughout their stay. Calls to the villa went unanswered, and when a housekeeper arrived to check on them, she hesitated as she noticed the heavy stillness inside. Unlocking the door, she stepped into a scene of unspeakable horror. Diane Gray's lifeless body lay on the cold marble bathroom floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. Her head bore the marks of severe trauma, and shards of glass from a shattered champagne bottle glistened amidst the chaos. The sight froze the housekeeper in her tracks, and she let out a scream that echoed through the halls. In the living room, Jeff Gray was slumped on the sofa, disheveled and unresponsive. His clothes were wrinkled, faintly stained with blood, and a haze of alcohol lingered in the air around him. When staff managed to rouse him, his responses were disoriented and mumbled. "I don't remember," he kept repeating, his voice hoarse and distant. The resort immediately alerted the authorities, and within the hour, the Maui police arrived. They cordoned off the villa, treating it as a crime scene, while gently escorting the shocked housekeeper and staff to another area. Forensic teams began their meticulous work, collecting evidence that would soon tell a story far darker than anyone could have imagined. Jeff was taken into custody for questioning. His initial statements were incoherent, and he repeatedly claimed to have no memory of the previous night. "I was drunk," he said, his head in his hands. "I don't know what happened." Despite his protests, the evidence surrounding him painted a damning picture. Bloodstains on his shirt matched Diane's. His fingerprints were found on the neck of the shattered champagne bottle, now identified as the weapon. Broken glass and signs of struggle throughout the villa suggested a violent confrontation. The staff, too, began to share their observations. Several recalled the tension between the couple in the days leading up to the incident, the arguments, Diane's attempts to calm Jeff, and his growing agitation. One server recounted the argument at the bar 2 nights prior, when Jeff had stormed out, dragging Diane with him. For Diane's family, the news was devastating. The vibrant, kind-hearted woman they had loved so dearly was gone, her life cut short in a place that was supposed to be a paradise. And the man they had welcomed into their family, the husband who had vowed to love and protect her, was now the prime suspect in her brutal death. The investigation into what had transpired on the night of February 14th was just beginning. But for those who had known Diane, one thing was certain: the dream honeymoon had turned into a nightmare no one could have foreseen. The villa, once a symbol of romance and luxury, now stood as a silent witness to a tragedy that would haunt everyone who stepped inside. February 16th, 1999. The Halakai Resort, once a place of laughter and love, had transformed into the focal point of a grim police investigation. The shocking discovery of Diane Gray's lifeless body sent ripples through the island community, and the evidence being collected only deepened the tragedy. Detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together the events that had led to the night of February 14th. The villa itself was a trove of clues. Forensic specialists meticulously examined every inch of the crime scene, and their findings told a story of rage and violence. The bloodied champagne bottle found shattered near Diane's body became the centerpiece of the investigation. Jeff Gray's fingerprints were found on the neck of the bottle, the pattern and placement suggesting he had wielded it with force. The fragments of glass embedded in Diane's wounds confirmed it was the weapon that had delivered the fatal blows. Signs of a struggle in the bathroom painted a harrowing picture of Diane's final moments. The splintered bathroom door with its broken lock revealed that Jeff had forced his way in after Diane had sought refuge. Blood spatter patterns on the walls and floor indicated Diane had tried to shield herself, but the attack had been relentless. Overturned toiletries, a torn shower curtain, and scattered glass told the story of a brief but desperate struggle. Outside the villa, investigators turned to the resort's security footage for answers. What they found added a chilling layer to the case. The CCTV footage from February 13th showed the couple leaving the resort bar. Jeff's hand was gripping Diane's arm tightly, his movements abrupt and forceful. Diane's posture was tense, her steps hesitant as she followed him back to the villa. Witnesses corroborated the footage, recounting Jeff's escalating anger during their argument at the bar. One staff member recalled hearing muffled shouting from the villa later that night, but no one had intervened, assuming it was just another lover's quarrel. Now those assumptions weighed heavily on everyone who had been there. As the evidence mounted, Jeff's initial claim of memory loss began to unravel. Detectives noted inconsistencies in his statements, and his demeanor shifted under questioning. He vacillated between claiming he had been too drunk to remember anything and offering vague recollections of the argument. By February 20th, the case against Jeff Gray was solidifying. The evidence, the fingerprints, the bloodied weapon, the CCTV footage, and the accounts from witnesses painted a damning picture. What had initially been a mysterious tragedy was now a clear act of violence, driven by jealousy and control. For those who had known Diane, the revelations were heartbreaking. Friends and family who had worried about her during the whirlwind romance now saw their fears realized in the most devastating way. The image of Diane, so full of life and kindness, was forever marred by the brutality of her final moments. The once idyllic villa was no longer just a place of luxury. It had become a grim monument to a love story that had spiraled into darkness. And while the investigation had answered many questions, it left one lingering. How had things gone so wrong? The next step was inevitable. Jeff Gray would face the consequences of his actions, but for Diane, it was too late. Her story, once filled with promise, had ended in the most tragic of ways. January 2000. Nearly a year after Diane Gray's tragic death, the trial of Jeff Gray began in a packed Chicago courtroom. The case, fueled by its shocking details and the allure of a honeymoon turned fatal, had captured national attention. The public was captivated by the story of a couple whose love had spiraled into unimaginable violence. Jeff Gray, now visibly thinner and more subdued, sat at the defense table, flanked by his legal team. His expression was stoic, but the weight of the evidence against him was palpable. Across the aisle, Diane's family, still grieving, sat quietly, their faces etched with pain and determination. They were here not just for Diane, but for justice. The prosecution wasted no time setting the tone. They painted Jeff as a jealous and controlling husband, a man whose polished exterior masked a dangerous temper and a deep-seated need for control. The prosecution delved into Jeff's history, introducing testimonies from former colleagues and acquaintances who described moments of unchecked anger and possessiveness. The forensic evidence became the centerpiece of the case. Experts testified about the shattered champagne bottle, the blood spatter patterns, and the splintered bathroom door. They walked the jury through the violent sequence of events, using diagrams and photos of the crime scene to illustrate Diane's desperate attempts to shield herself. The prosecution also relied on witness testimonies from the resort staff. Servers recounted Jeff's erratic behavior during the couple's stay, particularly the heated argument at the bar the night before Diane's death. CCTV footage played in the courtroom showed Jeff dragging Diane out of the bar, his grip firm and his movements forceful. The haunting images left the jury visibly shaken. On the other hand, the defense worked tirelessly to shift the narrative. They argued that the incident was a tragic accident fueled by intoxication and years of unresolved trauma from Jeff's troubled upbringing. They brought in psychological experts who described Jeff's volatile childhood, marked by an abusive father and a mother struggling with mental health issues. Jeff Gray is not a monster, the defense attorney stated in his opening remarks. He is a man who has carried the scars of his past into his present. On that night, those scars collided with alcohol and stress, leading to an outcome he never intended. The defense highlighted Jeff's claims of memory loss, emphasizing his intoxication on the night of the incident. They portrayed him as a man who had snapped in the heat of the moment, incapable of fully comprehending his actions. But as the trial progressed, the evidence and testimonies presented by the prosecution proved difficult to counter. Diane's closest friends took the stand, describing the subtle shifts in her demeanor during her relationship with Jeff. They shared stories of Diane's growing unease, her increasing isolation, and the small but telling signs of control that Jeff had exerted over her life. The prosecution closed their case with a powerful statement. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of drunken confusion. This was a calculated act of violence by a man who could not stand the idea of losing control over the woman he claimed to love. After weeks of emotional testimonies and compelling evidence, the jury deliberated for 3 days. On January 28, 2000, they returned with their verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Jeff Gray's face remained impassive as the verdict was read, but the courtroom erupted into a wave of emotion. Diane's family embraced one another, tears streaming down their faces as a sense of justice, though bittersweet, began to settle in. The trial had brought to light the darkness that had lurked beneath the surface of Diane and Jeff's relationship. It had laid bare the consequences of unchecked jealousy and control. For Diane's family, the verdict offered a measure of accountability, though no sentence could ever truly compensate for the loss of a life so full of promise. As Jeff Gray was led away in handcuffs, the chapter closed on one of the most harrowing cases the court had seen. But for those who had loved Diane, the story would never truly end. Her memory remained, a haunting reminder of a life cut tragically short. February 2000. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver Jeff Gray's sentence. The weight of the jury's guilty verdict hung heavy in the air, a grim conclusion to a trial that had exposed the darkest facets of a seemingly perfect love story. Jeff Gray stood before the court, his hands clasped tightly, his expression unreadable. In the gallery behind him, Diane's family sat together, their faces marked by a mixture of grief and quiet determination. They had endured every painful moment of the trial, reliving the tragedy in excruciating detail. Now they awaited the final judgment. The judge's voice was steady yet firm as he addressed Jeff. Your actions on the night of February 14, 1999 were deliberate and fueled by anger and control. Diane Gray was a vibrant, loving individual whose life was cut tragically short by your inability to confront your emotions without violence. The evidence presented in this courtroom has made it abundantly clear that you bear full responsibility for her death. The sentence was announced. Life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The weight of those words settled over the courtroom, bringing a sense of finality to a case that had shocked the nation. Jeff showed little reaction as the sentence was read. His head dipped slightly, but his demeanor remained stoic, as it had throughout much of the trial. As he was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, Diane's family exchanged quiet, tearful embraces. For Diane's parents, the sentence brought a measure of solace, a validation that justice had been served. But it could not erase the pain of losing their daughter, a woman whose kindness and passion had left an indelible mark on everyone who knew her. Diane was our light, her mother Helen said outside the courthouse. Her laughter, her compassion. It's something we'll carry with us forever. No sentence can ever bring her back, but knowing that Jeff will face the consequences of his actions gives us some peace. The aftermath of the trial rippled through both families. For Diane's loved ones, the sentencing marked the beginning of a long and painful healing process. They channeled their grief into advocacy, establishing a foundation in Diane's memory to support victims of domestic violence. For Jeff's family, the verdict cast a long shadow. Once proud of Jeff's accomplishments, they now faced the harsh reality of his actions. Public scrutiny and whispers followed them everywhere, and they retreated from the spotlight, burdened by the weight of shame and loss. The Halakai Resort, once a symbol of luxury and romance, also felt the echoes of the tragedy. The villa where Diane's life had ended became a point of infamy, its beauty forever overshadowed by the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Though the trial was over, Diane's story continued to resonate with those who heard it. She was remembered not as a victim, but as a vibrant, loving soul whose life had been stolen too soon. Her friends and family held on to her memory, ensuring that her legacy would endure. For Jeff Gray, the man who had once vowed to love and protect her, Life behind bars would now serve as a constant reminder of the irrevocable consequences of his actions. And for those who had known Diane, her loss remained a wound that time could never fully heal.